In a quiet English village, Eleanor Grayson, a reserved woman with a mysterious past, steps into a local shooting range, unnoticed and underestimated. Ignored by the regulars and dismissed by the reigning champion, her first shot shatters not only his record but also the assumptions of everyone around her. What begins as a routine day at the range spirals into a tense unraveling of secrets, rivalries, and a hidden skill that could change everything. This is a story of precision, perseverance, and the power of the overlooked. If you enjoy gripping tales of suspense and unexpected triumphs, please like and subscribe to the Silent Stories channel for more. Eleanor Grayson stood at the edge of the gravel lot, her worn boots crunching softly as she adjusted the strap of her faded canvas bag. The Ashwood Shooting Range, nestled in the rolling green hills of rural England, buzzed with the energy of locals and weekend warriors testing their aim. The air carried the sharp tang of gunpowder, and the late autumn sun cast long shadows across the range. Eleanor, in her plain gray coat, and with her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, blended into the background. The regulars, mostly men in camouflage jackets and polished boots, barely glanced her way as she approached the sign-in desk. To them, she was invisible, unremarkable, a woman out of place in their world of bravado and steel. The clerk, a grizzled man named Tom with a perpetual squint, handed her a clipboard without looking up. "Name, ID, and purpose," he muttered, his pen tapping impatiently. Eleanor scribbled her details in neat, unassuming handwriting and slid the clipboard back. Tom's eyes flicked over the form, then up at her, one eyebrow raised. "First time shooting?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Eleanor's lips twitched into a faint smile, her gray eyes unreadable. "Something like that," she said softly. Tom snorted, waving her toward the range with a dismissive gesture. "Lane 6. Don't hurt yourself." The range was alive with activity. Shooters lined up at their stations, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of pistols and rifles blending into a steady hum that echoed across the hills. At the far end, a small crowd gathered around Lane 10, where Marcus Holt, the range's reigning champion, held court. A former military sniper turned local legend, Marcus was a broad-shouldered man in his 30s, with a sharp jawline and a swagger that demanded attention. His latest score, 98 out of 100 on the 300-yard target, was the talk of Ashwood, and the regulars watched him with a mix of awe and envy. Marcus, aware of his audience, adjusted his cap and flashed a grin as he loaded his custom rifle, a sleek Accuracy International model that gleamed with care. "Let's see if I can tighten that grouping today," he called out, drawing chuckles from the crowd. Eleanor slipped into Lane 6, unnoticed. She set her bag on the bench, unzipping it to reveal a compact, well-maintained Sig Sauer P226 pistol. It was an older model, nothing flashy, but its matte black finish gleamed under the range's fluorescent lights. She checked the magazine with practiced ease, her movements quick and precise, though no one was watching closely enough to notice. The man in Lane 5, a burly regular named Dave, glanced over briefly, his eyes lingering on her plain attire before turning back to his own target. "Beginner," he muttered to his friend, a lanky man named Pete, who laughed under his breath. Eleanor didn't react. She adjusted her ear protection, slipped on safety glasses, and stepped up to the firing line. The range officer's voice crackled over the intercom. "Range is hot. Fire when ready." Eleanor took a deep breath, her posture shifting subtly, shoulders squared, feet planted, hands steady. She raised the pistol, her grip firm but relaxed, and sighted the target 25 yards away. The black silhouette stood stark against the white backdrop, its bullseye a small, distant challenge. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single point, the wind, the chatter, the weight of the crowd's indifference fading away. Her finger brushed the trigger, and with a sharp crack, the first shot rang out. The sound blended into the range's cacophony, unremarkable to the others. But when the range officer called for a ceasefire to check targets, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's target was pulled in, and there, dead center in the bullseye, was a perfect hole. Not a graze, not a near miss, a flawless shot. Dave, who had been joking moments before, stared at the target, then at Eleanor, his mouth slightly agape. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Pete nudged him, frowning. "That's no fluke, mate." Marcus, still at lane 10, didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the praise for his own tight grouping, his score inching closer to perfection. Eleanor reset her stance, ignoring the curious glances now drifting her way. She fired again. Crack, 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 each shot deliberate, each one landing within a hair's breadth of the first. By the time the range officer called for another ceasefire, the murmurs had grown louder. Her target was a cluster of 5 holes, so tightly grouped they almost looked like one. Tom, the clerk, wandered over, his squint deepening as he studied the target. "You sure you're new at this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Eleanor shrugged, her expression unreadable. "I've had some practice," she said simply, turning back to her pistol. Word spread quickly. By her third round, a small crowd had formed behind lane 6, their whispers buzzing like static. Marcus, sensing the shift in attention, finally looked over. His grin faltered as he caught sight of Eleanor's target, now riddled with a near-perfect cluster at 50 yards. He sauntered over, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and leaned against the barrier. "Nice shooting," he said, his tone friendly but laced with condescension. "You must have trained somewhere fancy to get groupings like that." Eleanor didn't look at him. "Just practice," she replied, loading another magazine. Marcus chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being upstaged, especially not by someone like her, a woman who looked like she'd wandered in from a village book club. The range officer, a wiry woman named Claire with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached with a clipboard. "We're running a scored round next," she announced. "Anyone want to challenge the board?" The leaderboard was Ashwood's pride, a record of the best shooters, with Marcus's name dominating the top spot for 3 years. A few regulars raised their hands, but all eyes turned to Eleanor. She hesitated, her fingers pausing on the magazine. She hadn't come here to compete, only to test herself, to feel the familiar weight of a weapon in her hands. But the crowd's expectation pressed against her, and something in Marcus's smirk pushed her forward. She nodded once, her expression calm. Marcus's smirk widened. "All right, new girl," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Let's see what you've got." The scored round was at 100 yards, a distance that separated hobbyists from professionals. The crowd grew, phones emerging to record the event. Marcus went first, his shots precise, his grouping tight. The wind was still, and his custom rifle sang with each pull of the trigger. When his target was pulled in, the score was 97, a near-perfect performance that drew applause. He tipped his cap, his confidence restored, and shot a glance at Eleanor. "Your turn," he said, his voice carrying a challenge. Eleanor switched to a borrowed rifle, an old but reliable Enfield that the range kept for visitors. She adjusted the scope with a speed that made Claire raise an eyebrow, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The range fell silent as Eleanor took her position. Her first shot echoed across the hills, followed by 9 more, each one steady, unhurried. The crowd held its breath as the target was pulled in. When it appeared, a collective gasp broke the silence. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes, with a grouping so tight it defied belief. The score, 100. A perfect round. Claire double-checked the target, her eyes wide. That's a new record, she stammered, her voice carrying over the stunned silence. Marcus's face froze, his jaw tight. The crowd erupted into whispers, some clapping, others staring at Eleanor, as if seeing her for the first time. Dave muttered, "Who the hell is she?" Eleanor packed her bag, seemingly oblivious to the attention. But Marcus wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his tone more accusation than question. Eleanor met his gaze, her gray eyes steady, unflinching. "Does it matter?" she replied, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Marcus pause. Before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the crowd buzzing in her wake. Back at the sign-in desk, Tom was waiting, his squint now replaced by a look of grudging respect. "You didn't put your full name on the form," he said, holding up the clipboard. "We need it for the leaderboard." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on her bag. She hadn't wanted this. Attention, recognition, the weight of her past dragged into the light. But the crowd was watching, and Claire was already scribbling notes. Eleanor took the pen and wrote, "Eleanor Grayson, Captain, Ret, British Army." Tom's jaw dropped. "You're military?" he managed. Eleanor gave a small nod, her smile faint but sharp. "Was," she said, handing back the pen. "Keep the board." "I don't need it." As she walked out into the fading light, the whispers followed her. The regulars pieced together rumors. A decorated sniper, a covert operative, a woman who'd walked away from a career most could only dream of. Marcus, still by lane 10, stared at the leaderboard, his name no longer at the top. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of being unnoticed, his pride bruised by a woman who'd barely acknowledged his existence. The village of Ashwood was small, and news traveled fast. By evening, the story of Eleanor's record-breaking performance had reached the Black Lion, the local pub where regulars gathered over pints of ale and plates of fish and chips. The air was thick with speculation. "Heard she's some kind of spy," one man said, leaning over his glass, his voice low as if sharing a state secret. "Nah, she's XSS, mark my words," another countered, his eyes wide with conviction. A third, an older woman named Margaret who ran the village post office, shook her head. "She's just Eleanor. Lies in that cottage by the woods. Keeps to herself." But even Margaret's practical tone couldn't dampen the growing legend. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complex. Eleanor had been a sniper in the British Army, one of the few women to qualify for such a role in her time. Her service had taken her to conflict zones across the Middle East and beyond, where she'd honed her craft under pressures most couldn't fathom. Sandstorms, ambushes, the weight of lives resting on a single shot. She'd been good, too good, earning commendations that were buried in classified files. But the cost had been high, friends lost, memories that woke her in the dead of night, a piece of herself left behind in the desert. 5 years ago, she'd retired to Ashwood, seeking a quiet life, a place where she could be just another face in the crowd. She'd almost succeeded, until today. Eleanor's cottage was a modest stone building on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by wildflowers and a low wooden fence that creaked in the wind. Inside, the walls were bare except for a single framed photograph above the fireplace, a snapshot of her unit, taken in a dusty outpost somewhere far from England. 8 soldiers, their faces weathered but proud, stood shoulder to shoulder under a scorching sun. Eleanor rarely looked at it, but tonight, as she cleaned her Sig Sauer at the kitchen table, her eyes lingered on the image. The familiar weight of the pistol in her hands had stirred something, a spark of the woman she'd been, the one who could steady her breath and make the impossible shot. She hadn't gone to the range to prove anything, only to feel that clarity again, the moment when the world narrowed to a single point. But now the village knew, and there was no going back. Back at the range, Marcus was grappling with his defeat. He lingered long after the others had left, his rifle case open on the bench as he cleaned his weapon with methodical precision. The leaderboard loomed in the corner, Eleanor's name scrawled in Claire's handwriting, then crossed out at her request. "Captain, huh?" he muttered, his fingers tightening around the cleaning rod. Marcus had built his identity around being the best, the one everyone looked to. He'd served in the military too, a sniper like Eleanor, though his tours had been less eventful, his commendations less secretive. Losing to her, someone who'd walked in without fanfare, without ego, cut deeper than he cared to admit. He wasn't a bad man, but pride was his vice, and Eleanor's quiet confidence had shaken it to its core. The next morning, the range was quieter, the buzz of yesterday's events still hanging in the air like gunpowder residue. Eleanor hadn't planned to return, but something pulled her back. Perhaps the need to prove to herself that yesterday wasn't a fluke, or perhaps a flicker of defiance against the whispers that had followed her out. When she arrived, the regulars were already there, their eyes tracking her every move. Tom, at the desk, gave her a nod that was almost respectful, a far cry from his earlier dismissal. "Back for more?" he asked, sliding the clipboard toward her. Eleanor signed, and without a word, her handwriting as precise as her shots. Marcus was there too, his posture stiffer than usual. He'd spent the night replaying Eleanor's performance in his mind, analyzing every detail, the way she'd adjusted the scope, the calm in her stance, the effortless precision of her shots. He convinced himself it was luck, a one-off. Today he'd prove it. "Fancy another round?" he called out as Eleanor set up at lane 6. The crowd perked up, sensing a rematch. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "If you want," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made Marcus's jaw tighten. This time, the challenge was at 200 yards, a distance that tested even the best shooters. A light wind had picked up, rustling the trees and adding a layer of difficulty. Marcus went first, his shot steady but not flawless. The wind caught one bullet just enough to push it off center, and his final score was 95. Respectable, but not unbeatable. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans, his eyes locked on Eleanor. She chose the same infield rifle, its weight familiar in her hands. The crowd was larger now, word having spread overnight through the village and beyond. Phones were out again, recording every moment. Eleanor ignored them, her focus absolute. The wind tugged at her coat, but her stance was rock solid, her breathing measured. She fired 10 shots, each one a study in precision, her adjustments for wind and distance invisible to the untrained eye. When the target was pulled in, the crowd fell silent. Another perfect score. 100. The holes were so tightly clustered it was as if a single bullet had struck 10 times. Marcus's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his hands clenching into fists. Claire, the range officer, shook her head in disbelief as she recorded the score. "That's 2 days in a row," she said, almost to herself. "Never seen anything like it." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others whispering about Eleanor's past. Dave, the regular from lane 5, pushed through to get a better look at the target. "She's not human," he muttered, half joking but half serious. Eleanor packed up again, her movements methodical, her face betraying nothing. Marcus approached, his voice low but intense. "You're not just some retiree, are you?" he said, searching her face for answers. Eleanor paused, her hand resting on her bag. "I'm just someone who knows how to shoot," she replied, her tone final. She turned to leave, but Marcus grabbed her arm, not hard, but enough to make her stop. The crowd hushed, sensing tension. Eleanor's eyes flicked to his hand, then up to his face, and something in her gaze, cold, unyielding, made him let go instantly. "Don't," she said quietly, and he stepped back, his bravado crumbling. As Eleanor walked away, the whispers grew louder. The village was small, and secrets didn't stay buried long. By evening, someone had dug up an old article from a military journal, mentioning a Captain Eleanor Grayson who'd earned a commendation for marksmanship in a classified operation in Helmand Province. The details were vague, redacted names, locations, dates, but it was enough to fuel the rumors. At the Black Lion, the regulars debated her past over pints. "She's got that look," one said, a retired policeman named Frank. "Like she's seen things we'll never understand." Another, a young farmer named Liam, leaned forward. "Bet she's done things we don't want to know about." Eleanor, meanwhile, was back at her cottage, the quiet of the evening wrapping around her like a blanket. She sat by the fire, her pistol cleaned and stored, the photograph of her unit now in her hands. The faces stared back at her, some smiling, some serious. She traced a finger over one in particular, a young man with a crooked grin, Private James Carter, who died on her last mission. She'd been the one to take the shot that saved their unit, but it hadn't been enough to save him. She'd left that life behind for a reason, but the range had reminded her of who she was. Not just a shooter, but a survivor, someone who'd faced chaos and come out steady. The next day, a stranger arrived in Ashwood. He was tall, with a clipped American accent and a suit that looked out of place among the village's muddy lanes and stone walls. He stopped at the post office, asking Margaret for Eleanor by name, his questions vague but insistent. "Just need to speak with her," he said, his smile too polished. Margaret, protective of the village's newfound legend, gave him nothing. "Don't know any Eleanor," she lied, her face impassive. The man thanked her and left, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Eleanor saw him from her cottage window, his silhouette unmistakable as he stood at the edge of her property, scanning the area before walking away. Her pulse quickened, memories stirring. Missions she'd buried, names she'd tried to forget. The man's suit and accent marked him as someone from her past, someone tied to the classified files she'd left behind. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew it wasn't good. Her hand drifted to the locked box under her bed, where she kept a second pistol, one she hadn't touched in years. The range became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with shooters from neighboring towns arriving to test their skills against the ghost of Eleanor's record. Marcus, humbled but determined, started training harder, his ego giving way to a grudging respect. He never spoke to Eleanor again, but he studied her targets, trying to decode the precision that had undone him. The leaderboard remained, a silent testament to the day a quiet woman had walked in and changed everything. Eleanor didn't return to the range. She didn't need to. Her point had been made, not to the crowd, not to Marcus, but to herself. She'd spent years hiding, blending into the background, but that day at Ashwood had reminded her, some skills, some truths, couldn't stay hidden forever. The stranger's visit, though, was a warning. Her past was catching up, and she'd need more than a perfect shot to face it. Over the next week, the village buzzed with theories about Eleanor. The stranger's presence only added fuel, with some. The days following Eleanor Grayson's record-breaking performance at the Ashwood Shooting Range were anything but quiet. The village of Ashwood, usually a sleepy haven of stone cottages and winding lanes, hummed with gossip. The Black Lion pub was packed each evening, locals and visitors alike dissecting the mystery of the woman who'd outshot Marcus Holt, their reigning champion. Eleanor's perfect score of 100 at 100 yards had become the stuff of legend. Her name, Eleanor Grayson, Captain, Ret, British Army, etched into the village's collective memory, even if she'd refused its place on the leaderboard. But as the whispers grew, so did the shadows of her past, creeping closer with the arrival of a stranger in a sleek black suit. Eleanor woke early the next morning, the air crisp with autumn chill. Her cottage, tucked away on the edge of the village, was her sanctuary, its walls thick with the silence she craved. She brewed tea, the kettle's whistle cutting through the quiet, and sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting to the range. The Sig Sauer P226, now cleaned and locked away, had felt like an old friend in her hands, its weight stirring memories she'd buried deep, dusty outposts, the crack of gunfire, the weight of lives on her trigger finger. She hadn't meant to draw attention, but the perfect shot had been instinctive, a reflex honed by years of training. Now, the village knew her name, and with it came questions she wasn't ready to answer. At the Black Lion, the rumors were thickening. Frank, the retired policeman, leaned over his pint, his voice low. "She's no ordinary retiree, I'll tell you that. Those shots? Surgical. Like she's done it under fire." Margaret, the postmistress, scoffed but didn't disagree. She'd seen Eleanor around the village, quiet, polite, always alone. "She's just Eleanor," Margaret insisted, but even she wondered. Liam, the young farmer, was more direct. "Bet she's got stories that'd curl your hair." The article someone had dug up, a grainy scan from a military journal, only fueled the fire. It mentioned a Captain Grayson, commended for marksmanship in a classified operation in Helmand province. The details were redacted, but the implications were clear. Eleanor was no stranger to high stakes. Back at the range, Marcus Holt was wrestling with his own demons. The leaderboard, once his domain, now felt like a taunt. He cleaned his rifle late into the night, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. His score of 97 had been a triumph, but Eleanor's 100 had eclipsed it, her tight grouping a silent rebuke. Marcus wasn't a bad man. His service as a sniper had earned him respect, but pride was his Achilles heel. He replayed her shots in his mind, the steady stance, the effortless scope adjustments, the calm that bordered on unnatural. "She's not just good," he muttered to himself. "She's better." He resolved to train harder, to reclaim his place, but a part of him wanted to know her secret, to understand the woman who'd undone him without a word. Eleanor hadn't planned to return to the range, but by mid-morning she was back, her boots crunching on the gravel. The regulars watched her now, their eyes sharp with curiosity. Tom, the clerk, gave her a nod, his usual squint softened by something like respect. "Lane 6 again?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of calm. The crowd was larger today, drawn by the legend of her first shot. Phones were out, recording her every move. Marcus was there too, his posture rigid, his custom rifle gleaming. "Rematch?" he called, his voice half challenge, half plea. Eleanor's gray eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "If you insist," she said, her tone flat but carrying a blade's edge. The challenge was set at 200 yards, a distance where wind and instinct separated the skilled from the exceptional. A breeze stirred the trees, adding a layer of complexity. Marcus went first, his shot steady but not flawless. The wind nudged one bullet off center, and his score came in at 95, strong, but not enough. He stepped back, his jaw tight, and watched as Eleanor took her place. She chose the same infield rifle, its worn stock familiar in her hands. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with expectation. Her shots rang out, each one a precise echo of the day before. When the target was pulled in, it was another perfect 100, the holes so tight they seemed impossible. The crowd gasped, then cheered, but Eleanor was already packing her bag, her movements methodical. Marcus approached, his voice low. "You're not just a retiree, are you?" Eleanor paused, her hand on her bag. "I'm just someone who knows how to shoot," she said, her tone final. He grabbed her arm as she turned to leave. Not hard, but enough to stop her. The crowd hushed. Her eyes flicked to his hand, then to his face, and something in her gaze, cold, unyielding, made him release her instantly. "Don't," she said, and he stepped back, his confidence crumbling. That evening, a stranger arrived in Ashwood. Tall, with a clipped American accent and a suit that screamed outsider, he stopped at the post office, asking for Eleanor by name. Margaret stonewalled him. "Don't know any Eleanor," she said, her face impassive. But Eleanor saw him from her cottage window, his silhouette lingering at the edge of her property. Her pulse quickened. He was no tourist. His posture, his too-polished smile, marked him as someone from her past, tied to the classified files she'd left behind. She didn't know his purpose, but she knew it wasn't benign. Her hand drifted to the locked box under her bed, where a second pistol waited, untouched for years. The range became a pilgrimage site, shooters from neighboring towns arriving to test themselves against Eleanor's ghost. Marcus trained harder, his ego giving way to respect. He studied her targets, searching for the secret of her precision. Eleanor didn't return. She'd made her point, not to the crowd, but to herself. Some skills, some truths, couldn't stay buried. As the village whispered her name, Eleanor prepared for what was coming, her past no longer content to let her hide.